Good morning, good evening, and good afternoon to everyone out there. Welcome to a panel for PAX Aus Digital 2021. The topic of this panel is Towards an Australian Tabletop Industry. Australia has a passionate and dedicated indie tabletop scene, which is well supported, but what it doesn't have quite yet is an industry of any size. But one is starting to grow, and that means we have a chance to foster that development and also plan it. How do we build that, and what kind of industry do we want to build? What can we learn from the early steps of other game industries like the computer game industry here and the industry in other countries? Or should we instead save our money and keep shipping our best ideas overseas where the money and the audience is already in place? Joining us for this topic are several industry experts from Australia and also around the world. And I'll do a quick introduction now. My name is Steve D. I'm acting as the moderator today, and I am the president of Tin Star Games. Also with us is Kim Brebach, who is the director of Good Games Publishing, probably the largest game producer in Australia by far. Also Matthew Aslan, who's the creative director of Platypus Industries, another local production house. And we have Stella Jahja, who's the media content creator from Meeple University and the Dice Tower, who's going to be helping us get insights into the game media area. We also have James Wallace, who is the
studio manager
of Green Games. Thank you very much. And
Green Board Games.
Thank you. Studio manager of Green Board Games, coming to us from the United Kingdom. And Cam Banks, who is the creative director at Fandom Tabletop, who is now in the New Zealand, but was based for 22 years in the United States. So let's just jump in and talk about the actual premise of this question. Is there a point where a national industry comes? Obviously, it's a continuous line, but is there a point where you would say, yes, we definitely have a sizable national industry that counts as an industry as opposed to just a few random cottage industries? Is there a litmus test that can be combined? Do you think we have definitely achieved that? I'll start with you, Kim.
I still feel like we're transitioning from cottage to something that I wouldn't say is a full-blown industry, but something bigger than cottage. I mean, there's only still a small number of Australian board game publishers. There's no local manufacturing. There's a bunch of fantastic content creators and a lot of artists and writers and creatives working for other companies all around the world. But I would say the number of people who receive their main employment directly out of board games and tabletop games in Australia is probably still well under 100 and probably under 50, I'm guessing, that substantially make most of their income from tabletop games. I don't know. What do you guys think? Is that even too much? I don't know.
Probably a little bit too much. I can't think of 5 publishers beside yourself. That's Grail Games. Well, there's Guff Studios, but that's just starting.
Guff Studios, yeah.
Yep.
There's Quillsilver, but they're in the development space, I guess.
Yeah, development and marketing. Yeah.
Yeah, and there's obviously Matt over there.
Yeah.
Platypus Industries and Tin Star Games. I don't know. Actually,
the 93, level 93.
Level 93.
Yeah.
Fractured, isn't it the role-playing game down here?
Yes.
Yep. Yeah. Wade's been drawing a salary for a couple of years, so he's doing very well with the Fractured RPGs. Which is an interesting question about whether it's easier for role-playing games than tabletop board games. James, what would you reckon is the size though in the UK? Is it comparable? Like, we think of you as being much more connected to success and money and power, and perhaps because of our colonial history. But what do you think the size of the industry is in the UK?
We have Games Workshop, which is bigger than several power companies over here.
Yeah.
Games Workshop is a colossus. We forget it because it's so massive. It is worth multiple £billion. Wow. It has been floated on the stock market since 1994. I literally can't remember its last market cap that I looked at, but I think it's somewhere ahead of £5 billion right now. Games Workshop is an industry in its own right. And of course, having something like that, it means people go into Games Workshop, people come out of Games Workshop and set up their own companies. There's an entire ecosphere around Games Workshop itself. Excuse me. Beyond that, the UK is pretty good these days. We have a lot of people working in tabletop. We have Asmodee, which is, Green Board Games isn't part of the Asmodee group. Asmodee UK is fundamentally a distributor. But when you talk about an industry, you can't just talk about the publishers because they cannot exist on their own. You have to think about the distributors, you have to think about the retailers, you have to think about the marketers, you have to think about all these other and events organizers, all people who are potentially making money out of the game scene, because it's an ecosystem. So I have to admit, I'm not over familiar with the Australia scene. I know you have a PAX Australia. We don't in the UK. I don't think there's a PAX Europe these days.
I don't think so, no.
So there are, you've got huge events. We have some decent size events here, but it has taken, pushing Games Workshop to one side for a moment, it's taken a while to get there. When I got in, when I started Hogshead Publishing in late 94, early 95, and I'm aware this is ancient history, we were publishing tabletop role-playing games at a time when no British role-playing company had been able to make a go of it. As a professional entity, there were people doing hobby products, essentially, a few hundred, maybe a couple of thousand, but none had been able to survive. And slowly building that up over the next 9 years. I did it by not thinking about the British industry, I have to admit, because I've been working with American companies and going over to GenCon and other American shows for a while. I had good links there. When I started Hogshead, it was like, okay, we're going to be a British company. We're going to pretend to be an American company. We're going to treat America as the primary market, because this is the other problem you guys have. It's a big country with a small population. I suspect that there are no Australian games companies, with the exception of the events ones, that are making a go of it based entirely on Australian sales. I think you're probably entirely reliant, just as we were 25 years ago, reliant on the great beasts of North America and Europe.
Yeah.
So I think before thinking about whether Australia has an industry, don't think in too insular a way about that. Think about it as being part of, you've got your own ecosystem, a word I use too much, I apologize. But think of it as part of a greater whole. It is a global industry. Think about how you collectively can attack the American market, how you can cut down your shipping costs, how you can work together to get product and publicize product in the American market and in the European market, all of that kind of thing. Collaboration is absolutely key. From the sound of it, it sounds like you're all in contact with each other. You're all talking to each other and probably working together already. That is an absolutely crucial first step.
I think that was something that I wanted to talk about a little bit, is how much are we working in concert? How much are the publishers talking to the media, talking to event organization? This is obviously, as mentioned, we don't have any printers here or manufacturing here. There are things that we are obviously missing, but are we actually communicating well? Stella, do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Just to respond to what was said before.
Yeah, sure.
I agree with that. I mean, Australia, there's not, like, the board game industry itself is still in infancy, I think, compared to video games, let's say. And then within Australia, it's still like you have to be working with other people from all around the world. Like, I mean, look at us right now. And from a more media content creator perspective, my YouTube, so our main gig is on YouTube, Meeple University, and then also the Dice Tower. But on the Meeple University, although it's Australian-based, Australian registered on YouTube, around 40%, and that is the majority, is from the US. And the interesting fact is that I talk to other publishers who collect data. They don't actually mention whose channel it is. Like, they have similar stats, around 40% US, and then there's Canada, UK, and then the country that they're from within the top 5. That's very interesting. So US still made up the majority of a lot of people's channels. Doesn't matter where they are. Doesn't matter where they're from. They're from Australia, they're from UK, and from US, of course, also US. So we really need to collaborate with other people. There's no way we can survive on its own. A lot of my clients also from the US, I think mostly from US, and then there's Europe and there's Australia. So Australia, New Zealand, sort of like Oceania, I put in one bracket, and then that's actually make a small part of our jobs. And Steve, sorry, I missed the point as well. You were asking me.
No, it's good. If you want to just follow on, as I've said, guys, if you want to follow on that, I was asking about how much the components of the industry are talking to each other and working with each other. Okay, are we collaborating well? Could we be collaborating better?
I think so. I think so. Like a lot of it through social media, I guess these days. I know Kim is very active on social media. Also Matt, and so do you, Steve. But because I don't have you on my Facebook, Cam and James, so I probably can't really see you commenting or whatever. But yeah, I think that's how social media. I mean, there's email, there's mailing list, but the main thing is you look for that information and then you collaborate with people. Facebook group is big. There's Twitter, there's Instagram, but you know, you want to get product information, just see what other people are doing. Obviously, Facebook. If you want to see some gossips, Twitter. I don't know. You know, like Twitter is that kind of place. But yeah, I think that's how the majority how we link to each other, and also through board games, playing online. Obviously, we've also used historically events, but that's been curtailed a bit for the last 2 years. We have the TGDA, which is working as a sort of collaborative body. Is it a good one? Could it do more? Obviously, it's run by volunteers a lot of the time, so you know we are doing our best. But is that something that we want to see developed and made bigger, representing us? Has it been something? I mean, obviously, I think we've all used its Facebook group, for example, but what else could it be doing? I think it's been doing well, isn't it? Like with the DEF CON before PAX. I mean, I'm from media perspective, but I'm also part of Gulf Studio, where I hear what Carl is saying. Carl is part of the volunteer. I shouldn't probably talk too much. I think Matt and Kim is probably more involved on those. Well, Matt, is it true that most of your audience, or at least the biggest chunk of your audience, is in the US?
Yeah, definitely. You can't deny it. You're always going to be a slave to the US market, whether you like it or not. As much as you can do all the cons here, all the social medias here and things like that, it's a trickle compared to the torrent that is the US market. The one thing I've found is that the US market is, of course, used to shopping from the US and therefore paying low postage prices. Have you run into that, where they're surprised at sticker shock? Generally not, because the way you're shipping is the way that the American companies are shipping anyway. So your majority of your stock is in US warehouses, right? Using US logistics anyway.
It is an interesting point though, because when we started, we took a very a specific strategy, and this is probably true for New Zealand and the UK as well. You'd see, like, let's be honest, as the Australian board games industry is built on the back of crowdfunding. There wasn't really one at all before Kickstarter, and that's going to be true of many, many different countries' publishing industries at the moment. When we started, we already had a thing in Australia with Kickstarter games where you'd get a game here and it'd be, say you're paying $40 and then suddenly you get whacked for $30 extra in shipping. So you're really paying 70, possibly US dollars, which ends up being $100 for what looks like a $30 game or a $40 game. And so there was a lot of just constant outrage about that. And when we started, we tried to find the smartest ways to do cheap shipping anywhere in the world. And so we looked at sending stuff from China. And actually I worked with David from Growl Games. We were just talking at a designer event once, and I told him about this method, and he thought, I'm going to give that a try with one of the small games that they had, and it worked really well, just sending stuff everywhere in the world directly from China if it's a small game. That has kind of loosened up a lot of stuff. We did our first campaign that way, and we still use mailing directly from China as well. But like Matt said, most of the time now you send a shipment out from China to multiple different fulfillment points. So you send one to the US, one to Europe, and one to Australia, and then you do a little bit of fulfillment directly from China. But lowering those shipping costs down is just a critical part of any publisher outside the US finding enough mass to kind of be financially viable. So that's one key thing for any Australian wannabe publisher or designer is to really make sure you get your head around the tedious nightmare of global logistics. It's just not fun at all, but if you don't do it right, you will get crushed.
Matt's laughing because it's true.
Yeah.
I've been delivering during COVID, man. Don't ever talk to me.
This is not a new problem. This has gone way back. This is why Hogshead Publishing did all its printing in the US 25 years ago. And to go back to something you said at the start, Steve, I think it is potentially easier for RPG publishers because book publishing is a lot easier. The logistics of manufacturing a board game are complicated and require specialist knowledge, particularly if you're going to produce something that's really good looking. Books you can print anywhere. I did a Kickstarter a few years ago. We ended up looking at the shipping costs. We did 2 separate print runs, one in America for the American market and one in Europe for the rest of the world, because that was the cheapest way of shipping it. Even splitting the print run like that worked out cheaper than just doing one print run and shipping it globally. So the logistics, it's really worth getting someone who knows that. And the advantage of having these industry connections is that you can tap into specialist knowledge, people who have been there before. Even if the industry is comparatively young, you're all learning together. One of the reasons Hogshead survived back in the day was because I had these connections to American companies. So the moment I came up against something, and I made some horrendous mistakes, there are massive pitfalls in the route to bringing board games to market. And pretty much everyone either has experts and friends that they can talk to already in industry, or will fall in those holes. It is very rare that I hear about a company that just does it right the first time on their own. So yes, shipping at the moment globally is a catastrophe because shipping from China, the prices are up about 600% on the year. Yes, 600%, they have gone up 6 times. We do all our manufacturing in China at the moment, and by God, I wish we didn't.
Have you found the same, Cam, with role-playing stuff from New Zealand?
Well, it's interesting because obviously, I mean, I don't have almost any real connection or plugged into the New Zealand role-playing publishing or indie circuit at all. I mean, one of the weird things about my situation, I work for an American company who has offices in the UK and Poland and a few other places of the world, but the US is mainly where we get things done. It's all the offices are there pretty much. So I'm working as an employee of an American company, not a New Zealand company. We haven't got an entity here in this country yet. And one of the things that really makes me sort of look ahead and see what the changes are going to be in the global market will be how much dependency we have on China, which right now, as you said, James, I mean, is a huge issue because I've got many people who are waiting on things to be delivered, not just from Kickstarter, but from just general traditional mainstream publishing because everyone went to China for cheapness, right? I know when I was working with a Chinese company for Atlas, we would compare the cost and the quality and everything else with some American printers, and we just couldn't match it with domestic. We had to go to China because it was way cheaper. I mean, the time it took to get it shipped was an issue. If you wanted to be punctual and like send it up quickly, we had a place in Minnesota which would do printing local. But the kind of products that people want these days, you can't just say, oh, I'm going to print a book. You really have to go quality because our biggest comparison is Wizards of the Coast, and they make amazingly high quality books. But you've also got Free Legion, who are publishing in Europe, and every single European publisher somehow has the best books ever, which just drives people in America crazy. And Modiphius is getting books out that are amazingly high quality. So if you push out a book now into the RPG market and you want to be taken seriously, either you say, I'm a small press company and therefore it doesn't matter, and you can make cool, interesting experimental books which people love, but the kind of sales tail for that is like really, really small. Or you try and compete in that sort of second tier, or even try and go for the top tier. And in that case, you have to go to China. So I think if you're looking at what a tabletop industry in Australia is going to look like, it's well, can we do it in Australia? Can we get that sort of printing kind of tech expertise imported into domestic market? And if so, great. But I think you're going to find that unless you find a really good domestic printer in the States, and then have them ship somewhere local into these distribution chains and the warehouses and things there, or you somehow solve the problem we have right now with COVID and international shipping lanes and shipping containers being, sitting in a port for 3 months. There's no other alternative. So I'm intrigued to find out what people's suggestions might be, because especially if in New Zealand, we're just tiny. I mean, I think Etherworks is doing an amazing job of supplying and sort of sending things out for Kickstarters to New Zealand and Australia. But I don't even think any of those people like them or anyone else who's currently working to do this is going to have the lock on it. It just isn't possible to do it as a one company thing.
I've been looking at a couple of these kind of issues for upcoming projects, and there's a couple of big campaigns at the moment that are active right now on Kickstarter. So, for example, Earthborn Rangers, its whole value proposition is that it will do regional manufacturing. So they're planning to do some manufacturing in the US for the US North American market, and I think at least either in Europe or perhaps in Europe and the UK, if you draw a distinction between the two, and then some in China as well. Certainly not possible to do it in Australia. It's just we don't have the capacity to do that sort of board game manufacturing here. So that's an interesting one. But I think one of the challenges is, last time I looked, I guessed that they would get to about 6,000 backers, maybe 5,000. And that's, unless they also have localization arrangements tied up with European companies to publish in Europe, that's enough to get them maybe 2,500 backers in North America. And last I counted, when I counted it up, looked like about 1,200 backers in Europe and the UK combined. That's not enough to run a print run of if you're trying to hit that sort of, the real sweet spot in manufacturing is 5,000 copies, 7,000 copies is where you start to get things flatten out, and you don't start to see many kind of returns on the unit costs there. So even 3,000 copies, you're paying more per copy. And then that all gets amplified through the retail system. So one of the big challenges for that approach is, can you get enough volume to deal with that? And I think Earthborn Rangers is going to be in this really interesting position where, despite all their best efforts, they're going to find it, they're going to need to know that they can sell at least that many copies again, or double the amount of copies they got for their Kickstarter backers into retail. And the catch for that particular game is it's quite expensive, because they always planned on doing this regional manufacturing, and it has, I think, 500 cards in it, which is a very large amount of cards for a card game. So it's a fairly expensive proposition, and those kind of propositions tend to do better on Kickstarter than they do in retail. So they're in a bit of a catch-22 where I'm not sure that was the best experiment. The game looks fantastic, and I'm sure it is really good. It's got a good pedigree of designers behind it from FFG. So I'm sure there's some fantastic things about it, but it faces some challenges in scale. But if the second example is Firecraft, is that the dragon game? Do you guys know that
Flamecraft.
one? Flamecraft, that's the one, sorry. That's sitting today with 13 days to go at 13,000 backers. My prediction is at 25,000 backers. It can do whatever the hell it wants, right? And they've already tied up some deals with Lucky Duck publishing out of Poland and France, who are now moving into the localization space. And I predict we're going to see a lot more of this kind of stuff, where if people can get localization deals arranged prior to their Kickstarter, then they can split at least 2 production runs, one between Europe and one in North America, and hope fairly reasonably to hit that 3,000 backer mark in each of those places. And then everything else they want to print for retail is just on top of that. So they should be able to do 5,000 copy print runs in both of those territories, and maybe one in China for some reason. But it's still predicated on the fact that the US printing companies, there's not many of them. If everybody wanted to suddenly use US manufacturing, everything in the world would grind to a halt, and we'd all be waiting 2 years for our games. So there's simply not the capacity, because you've got 10, 12 Chinese printers churning out a lot of games versus 2 or 3 in the US. And even with the big upgrade happening to the Ludofax plant in the US, there's I think a $16 million upgrade or something like that to expand their capacity and the quality of what they can do and the different types of components they can deal with. That's still, I don't think that's going to increase the capacity nearly enough to meet demand. So there's an interesting bunch of challenges for people looking to try and make games locally to dodge the, I would guess, 1 or 2 year long shipping nightmare that we're all in right now. And maybe it's permanent. I mean, that's starting to hear more and more people talk about it being permanently 3 times what it was, which is, a total game changer. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Oh no.
Matt, you've got probably the most difficult in terms of getting miniatures and stuff for your most recent game. I assume they came from China as well?
Yeah, miniatures will all be done in China. There's no specialist here could even come close to being able to make even just the molds, let alone any of the sampling.
Except for the UK, right?
Yeah.
Games Workshop. They're all in-house, aren't they?
Yeah, but they still manufacture in China.
Yeah. Which is an interesting question. I mean, as we get this more dispersed world, that comes back to sort of the original question. I mean, obviously there are things we can't do in Australia, at least right now. So is it better to have just like conclaves of different artists as opposed to an industry? What do you think is the difference between those two things? You know, if we just concentrated on finding good game designers and then, you know, going off and selling those to companies, selling designs, like if you were thinking about the future, would we do better to just send more of our Australians over to Essen and American cons to get contracts to produce things over there rather than trying to build up more people making games here?
I think you're going to get people doing it here regardless. You're always going to have that indie community regardless of where you are in the world of people who just want to make stuff. It'd be nice if we could build a bit of structure here and, you know, even get a bit of light manufacturing with, you know, just card games and books and things like that. We won't be able to get any of the specialist stuff that's required in the bigger, heavier games here in Oz. But even just that start could be, you know, something that specializes in Australia.
So, well, that brings us to the sort of the other question then of this thing is what are the things that we want to do as we build up the local production, manufacturing, delivery things that we can learn from the US market, from the UK market when they were small and going large, growing. Can you sort of, I know you haven't been in the industry for, you're not an old wise grandfather who's been there for since the very beginning of the 70s, but what can you tell us about the American growth?
Yeah, I'm trying to get that look going, but it's not necessarily succeeding yet. You know, still a bit of ginger left in there. But no, the thing is that in the 2000s with third edition of D&D and then the sort of escalation of role-playing games into whatever we call this new golden age it is now, I mean, you really just see an explosion coupled not only with PDF and digital sales, but also with the Kickstarters and having people fund things up ahead. It certainly made things a whole lot easier, but it did bring in the problem then of delivery and whether people can sort of count on that happening soon, or can you walk into a game store like you used to do, pick it off the shelf and go home with it? You can't do that to many things now. Not even just with Kickstarters, but sometimes the store doesn't have it. You've got to order it, or you've got to have it sent off to you from somewhere else. And people are really clever. I think they're going to find a game and they're going to ship it in from wherever they can get it. And if you provide that avenue, then that's great. So to your point before about, what might be sort of happening now and sort of going forward in terms of how the US is doing, I think you might find that we start doing things a little more video game-like with studios who then partner with sort of big publishers / aggregate folks. I mean, I could definitely see someone like Asmodee doing a whole lot more of that, just absorbing up all these studios and making things happen around the world. The studio doesn't have to worry about the sort of logistics of getting things to the market. They just have to worry about, getting the funding to make the thing they want to do themselves. My biggest concern always is, can you pay people well enough to do what they want to do in this business? And I think that's consistently the sort of the rallying cry of designers and creators. It's like, well, I'd love to make more games, but I can't pay my rent. I can't do whatever with it. I can't put food on the table. I think I'm worth X dollars. And then the publisher's like, no, you're not. I can get this from someone else cheaper. So there needs to be some sort of understanding at some point between the sort of the executive level and the creator level, where we all agree that the cost that we need to be putting on the table needs to be perhaps less on its gigantic print cost and more on paying the creators to keep doing this and having studios that turn around with full-time employees or contract people who are getting paid well. So that's kind of my soapbox at the moment, I guess. But I feel that that's a way forward. I think that my experience especially with Margaret Wise Productions and even at Atlas to some degree, people there wear so many hats. You'll be at a company and you've got, oh, I'm the marketing person. I'm also the game designer. I'm also someone who writes ad copy. I'm also going to a convention running games for people. If you've got the same person who designs the game, sells the game, markets the game, has to talk to the printer about the game, runs the game at a convention and sells it at the convention, and that's one person, that person's very, very stressed out. That is the norm, right? For almost all of the business.
Yeah, so I think that's what we want to, I guess, get away from. But it's a difficult question, and I think particularly, as you say, because there is that issue of making sure that there's an agreement across the industry of what things are worth and what is a reasonable pay rate, because all these industries depend on, to some extent, people who are doing hobby work and are happy, therefore, to take low pay and things like that. Is there, and the computer game industry, for example, has just tried to make a worldwide union to try and sort of tackle this kind of issues. I don't know if there's anything like that in the US or anything, though. Like, there's no standardization or anything. What about the UK? There's no, anything like that. Yeah. So there's I think they're getting the word out, but it's mostly in computer games. Again, to start off, to just try to have a standardization there. So we can, of course, piggyback, as you've said. James, do you have any thoughts on if you could go back and help the British game industry start again? Is there anything that you'd change or try to focus on, do differently?
Oh, it's a good question. Because we're kind of, the British games industry has been around since the late 70s, when Games Workshop set up to primarily to distribute. Originally, they were making wooden classic board games, and then they almost out of the blue got the exclusive distribution rights to D&D in the UK, and kind of grew from there and started up a newsletter, which it wasn't originally called White Dwarf. It was called Owl and Weasel originally, but became White Dwarf.
Yeah.
Particularly in the UK market, there's this huge passion and nostalgia for White Dwarf as it used to be as a role-playing magazine. Every few years, someone comes along and goes, "We're going to do a new White Dwarf," and they lose a lot of money and it goes away.
Yeah,
stuff like that. Stuff like, you cannot create the industry as it was when you were getting into games. And I see a lot of people still trying to do that, and I think a lot of the OSR stuff is coming out of that. The industry is a business. It's about the business end of things. It will function by modern business rules. It's not going to pretend that it's still 1984 just because you had a good time back in 1984. There is a market for nostalgia products, but the games industry is surprisingly fast moving. It's surprisingly fast changing. And again, talking as an industry rather than just as a market and just as a player base, there are new ecosystems. I'm saying that again. There are new niches evolving for people to come in and make a living. Streamers and not just podcasters, but actual play. Is 5 years ago that didn't exist. Yeah. These days there are people making pretty serious money doing it essentially full time. I would say no. I would not. I don't think I'd change anything, because it has to evolve, and it will evolve at its own pace to the needs of the local community and the local market and the local industry. You do in Australia have the problems of a comparatively small population and comparatively enormous geography. Yeah. So there are logistics not just in distribution, but also in organizing get-togethers and conventions and things like that. Though the last 2 years have proved that we don't rely on conventions.
Yeah.
They're enormously good at introducing people to games that they wouldn't previously have come across, but they're not essential. I don't see a way around that. That's obviously in the UK, where we have many more people and much less space. Conventions are you know, certainly it used to be there was something every weekend, and it was, you know, maybe 150 miles away. I don't have any particular insight into that, so I'll shut up.
Kim, I think you wanted to make a point.
Yeah, I mean, when we're talking about things that are maturing the scene here, and if I use that word, there's a few really key things. One is there are some key conventions that have been running for many years. So I'd do a big shout out to CanCon, who's been running for decades now. And the board game scene there, it's not huge because it's mostly a tabletop wargaming convention, or historically has been, but board games and role-playing games have always been a part of that as well. And the board game space in that area has basically grown till it can't grow anymore. And there's quite a few seats made available there. And because it's Canberra and halfway between Sydney and Melbourne, we do get a lot of designers and people in the industry going to that event. It's a very, very casual event, run in a giant barn, effectively a very old convention center in Canberra. But it's because of that, it's disarmingly, charmingly casual. And there's a good collegiate sort of vibe of everyone who goes to that event. And a lot of game designers go and just non-stop for 3 or 4 days straight, play each other's games. And then as soon as the convention's over, they'll go to their hotels or, you know, Airbnbs and keep playing each other's games. So there's events like that happen. Now, then I'd call out PAX Australia and PAX Melbourne, I should say, and they've done a fantastic job there. And in recent years, they've really understood that they have the capacity to help lift up the game design scene in Australia now. So they've been running board game design. So they've been running the Collaboratory part of the tabletop area, which is, for you guys who don't know, a space, I think it's usually got about 12-ish big tables, and game designers get to showcase their game, I think, for 2 or 3 sessions over the weekend. And publishers or media people like Stella and publishers like me can go and just walk the tables and have a look at new and interesting things that are coming up. And I don't have to arrange a whole bunch of meetings. I can just, and I don't have time to look at everything, but I can go, here's the 20 games that look the most interesting for the type of games we're looking for. And I can go and play those games and just sit down and play with designers who are playing with other random people. And they're not doing a pitch and they don't have the stress of the pitch. We're just playing a game. And if I think it has some interesting aspects for us, we can follow up from that later. But again, in that space, all the designers play each other's games and game developers. They'll be trying things out. Again, that sort of collegiate stuff where they're just helping each other skill up and learn and swapping information, swapping ideas and building skills. So I know Matthew and I have been sort of part of that scene for a while and really enjoying it. And then prior to the PAX Australia event, there's the DevCon event that Tabletop Game Designers of Australia runs, which is invaluable as well. And it's like a concentrated version of that over one. Nice. Is it always just an evening, guys?
It's just usually one night.
4 hours ish. Yeah. And again, that's a networking opportunity for people and some small talks, sharing people. Matt's done a talk there. I've done a talk there. Stella, you might have, I can't remember, but yeah. So there's a lot of events like that are happening, and I think those kind of things are a good reflection of where we should be at now. I know TGDA also has a mentorship program, which is good. I feel a bit guilty that I haven't really jumped in on that, but I try and do things like this to sort of help more wider numbers of people sort of school up on things. But yeah, so there's those kind of things that are happening in Australia. Now there's also more and more small events popping up, like regional conventions that are quite small, 200 or 300 person conventions. So there's Shepardcon, so Shepardcon. There's BorderCon, which is on the border of New South Wales and Victoria. That's been running for many years. There's a new one that was just been cancelled in the pandemic, but it was on Phillip Island, just sort of east of Melbourne. Board Game Getaway that Stella was going to go to, and I was trying to get to, but we're locked down, so
I know,
no luck. And that's just you all go to the same sort of holiday adventure camp, and you stay there all weekend and you just game together. But they're very interested in getting game designers and publishers to come and showcase stuff there. So we have a developing convention scene, completely smashed and frustrated by COVID, but it was bubbling up, and I'm sure once we get the lid on COVID stuff, it'll bounce back and people will just be going at that stuff so hard.
It's interesting, Kim, you said the Collaboratory. I don't think that existed at the start of PAX Australia. PAX Australia still consists of what, 70% video game? Okay, 70% video game, 30% board games, would you say? But I think it's getting bigger. I'd like to say or think that that's getting bigger, and Collaboratory, that's growing.
Yeah,
but, you know,
well, the Collaboratory is just it's a small section of the tabletop space, and the tabletop space has about 1,200 seats in it for open play board games, which is a fairly large amount. And you go to Essen, there's no public play space, precisely zero public play space. You can't sit down and play a game outside of somebody's booth. So you don't have that opportunity to meet and greet people. GenCon, there's obviously huge halls full of public space, but most of them are events, and you have to kind of wait till the events die down and tables free up before you can just kind of play with your friends that you might be meeting. So it doesn't have that, but that's fine. So yeah, there's a different nature of the events in Australia, but public play space and just people coming together from the various parts of Australia is a big part of that. And people just going, hey, we see each other once a year. And I remember you from the last convention, and we're catching up again. We're playing a fun game and having time, fun times.
Kim, I'm pretty sure I saw you first at Essen. Like, you're in Sydney, I'm in Melbourne. Is that right? I have a feeling the first time I saw you was in Germany.
On the subject of events, Stella, what do you think that the media voices could be doing more that is targeted to an Australian culture? Because most of the time when I see things, even if they're being produced by Australians, they're reviewing the latest American and European games. And there isn't like, hey, let's really spotlight on this. But I do know there's a demand among Australian customers. I've heard from storekeepers that there is some interest in, oh, this was made here. This was made in Sydney. This was made in Melbourne. Do you think the reviews and videos and YouTube things could be doing more of this sort of thing to put a spotlight on them?
If there are enough, but as I say, like a lot of these games are coming from overseas, from Australia.
Right.
It's not enough. Come on, Kim and Matt. Wink, wink. And Steve. So there's just not enough there. I do trying to increase the awareness of games because I'm not only on YouTube, but I'm also having a fortnightly board game meetup in Melbourne here. Matt has been there as well. Yep. Can bring your games, play your prototype. So just basically just have people here increase awareness. If I review or if I do a game by Australian designer like Phil Walker Harding, I would try to mention it. And if it's made by in Australia, I'll try to, make a point that it's Australian, it's like a little bit proud, that sort of like proud feeling. But in reality, that's just not enough. If I'm only focusing on Australian games, that means I wouldn't have enough content to go online. That's the only thing. I'm happy. It doesn't matter for me where it's coming from. A little, obviously prouder with the Australian. Like I work with David Harding for The Gardens. He's very proud because it's about Sydney. It's about where he's from. And I kind of I've mentioned a little bit in my video, which I don't think it's out there yet, but it's recording. But yeah, I'd like to, but it's just, I'm hoping that it will grow more. I'll try to always encourage people from Australia. If I have, live stream, I try to my best to get publishers to involve Australian. This is a worldwide giveaway or something, and then Australia is including. But I try to do my part. But yeah, I'm patiently waiting for it to grow more.
Yeah, well, there's only maybe 10 to 20 Australian design games that are likely to be released on the retail market every year. And many of them are not by Australian publishers. They'll be an Australian designer getting a go somewhere else. And I think Australian content creators are pretty good at mentioning the people, the personalities, and where the games have come from. There is an interesting new model that's emerging in Australia with the board game BBQ Crew. Stella, I don't know how much you've had to do with them, but this is a very interesting model, which I haven't seen in any other country. And I think it's a really interesting niche. So it's 9 absolute
9
board
people.
game fans, 9 people who just podcast twice a week, reviewing at least 3 games, and then often with special guests on. So the turnaround of the podcast is really, really big, really fast, because they've got 9 people to juggle it around between, so they don't get burnt out, and they mix it up between the people and that kind of stuff. But that's really cool alone. But what's most interesting is they've recently started going and doing public events that they organize and host themselves. And this is a 12-hour-long day, usually in a good quality like sports club or something like that, where there's food available, drinks available, and a good venue with proper lighting, good tables, nice seats, proper toilets and everything, right? And then they turn up and they teach people their favorite games, and you can request games that you know that they like, and they will teach people. So they're doing it as a growing the community thing. And I think it's such a fantastic model for just how to help grow the industry. And I've seen a lot of new people come to those events, or the couple I've been to in Sydney, that are just fairly new to games, but they've heard about the podcast, they like the Australian character of it, and then they come to these events and they get to meet kind of personalities on the podcast, and they get to feel like they're part of a community. And I imagine it's kind of like the similar scene in role-playing communities, but it's really community focused. And I think that's a really interesting model. Again, at the moment, it's totally been beaten in the gutter by COVID because there's been multiple events in a row cancelled with all our outbreaks here. But again, that will go next year. They'll be roaring back with a lot of events.
Did you go to the one in Sydney?
Yeah, and it was really good. It's fantastic.
It's just like Brisbane, Sydney, and Melbourne. I couldn't go to Melbourne because they rescheduled it to Shepardcon. I'm already saying
I went to Melbourne.
Yeah, and they sell out. They sell out really quickly. They could have nearly double the number of people, but they've got to manage their growth, and that's wise. You know, they don't want to burn out. And
the next one is the 28 or 27, but it needs to be cancelled now. That's
lockdowns hitting it hard. Speaking though, you said about the Australian character of that podcast. I want to just talk to Matt a little bit about, like, you're about to put out a game about drop bears, which is certainly most of the games that Australian companies and designers have produced have not had much, if any, Australian content. And I'm wondering if we should, like, it's partly due to our cultural cringe that we don't like to throw Australian cliches out to the world, but you've chosen to do so. I'm wondering what reaction you've had to that and why you made that choice, and if you think we should do more of it.
Yeah, it was exactly the thing you're talking about, Steve. I'm an Aussie designer. I want something that is distinctly Australian, that'll stick out in the market because it's something that an American wouldn't do, or a European designer wouldn't do. So just looking for that niche, and Drop Bears was fantastic. It's being received amazingly well already.
Great.
And it's not even close to its Kickstarter launch.
It's got good hype around it.
Sorry?
It's got good hype. James and Cam, do you know about Drop Bears?
I am learning about it as I hear about it from you now.
Basically in everyone's backyard in Australia.
Yeah. One of my favorite stories.
Yeah.
Yes, so there's a miniatures game coming out with that concept from Platypus and Matt.
It's not real.
It's so
real. It's real. Totally real. Don't lie.
But it's part of a series as well. So there's going to be more continued Australian content based in this horror genre, all set in the Australian laws. I'm hoping with the next one, I'm going to be working with a local Aboriginal artist on a localized Aboriginal story and turning that into a horror game as well, which we just don't see, and trying to find local artists and things that are so distinctly Australian that even if you didn't know where it was made or anything, you saw it on a shelf and it had that instant feel that it was different.
Yep.
I would say, you know, capitalize on your differences, capitalize in terms of the global market on the fact that you have this unique personality within the games and the global perception of what the Australian personality is as well. I mean, don't necessarily play up to stereotypes, but certainly with Hogshead, we capitalized on the fact that we were a British company. We went in hard on the, you know, this is British role-playing games, the British sense of humor and all the rest of that. And it made us distinctive. Don't try and do, you know, if you do American style products, then immediately you're up against every single American company, and there is nothing to distinguish your games from them. anything you can do to make your game stand out a bit on the global market is all good.
That's exactly
and there is a global fondness for Australia and Australians as well. It's generally perceived as one of the good places, I think.
It's completely mystifying to me, though, obviously.
Yeah, it's funny. Even Australia, the Martin Wallace game, published by a New Zealand publisher.
Yes, Mill Sims. Yeah, that's right.
There's been an experiment recently to actually have a badge for Develop Down Under that we're offering to that Half Monster developed it for a game company in Brisbane. The question is whether that alone is it attractive to people like Matt and Kim? Would you put it on your games? Is it attractive to international audiences just to see this was made in Australia, or is it more about we want to see Australian character? Is that something that you think you would proudly put on a game, Matt?
I guess it's making sure that it's recognizable. Just any branding or graphic icons or anything like that, if it doesn't have a recognizable purpose or anything, it's just taking valuable real estate on a box.
Yep.
So I mean, the Australian made logo was so synonymous with products for years and years.
I think that's the hope, is to try to make. I think the hope is to try to make a game version of that, but unless industry folks want to use it and see it as valuable, it's hard to develop.
It's got to have that value.
Yeah.
That incentive.
I'll be honest and say that it hasn't appealed to us doing something like that. But we, the character of the games that we make are that they're a reflection of Australian multicultural society, even without being very Australian about that. And I don't know how to quite say that, but if you look at any of our games and the characterization of the people in it, you will find people from all over the world will be able to find themselves in our games. And so if I'm going to try and think about how we bring Australian character into games, is that multiculturalism. And we get comments on that aspect of it. And I think we do that. There's not, I'll be honest and say, I don't think there's many people that do it better than us. Our games are incredibly diverse, people with disability in our games, people of all different cultures. So, and we've had people contact us and say, I found myself in your game for the first time ever in any board game. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And that is a sort of a multicultural global outlook. That is a character of our games. And if we reach a wider amount of Australians, because we reflect the true wider pool of Australian multicultural life, and we bring those people into gaming and help them find a comfortable, familiar place to find themselves in the game space, then that's more important to me than whether we're saying it's made in Australia. It's just whether we reflect the reality of Australian multicultural urban life, at least. And I think that's going to be true to some degree in many, many other countries. Obviously, North America, you would hope that that's a selling point for that kind of stuff, and the UK as well, obviously. So that's been our approach so far.
Yeah. On that question, I think, is there a perception of Australian design principles or something for those of you, for Cam and James, like is there a sense of, oh, what's coming out of Australia? Or have you seen this, it's the new Australian thing yet? Or are we just not any kind of collective imprint in terms of that?
It's funny because I was thinking just now about, putting something there saying, designed in Australia and so forth. You would first need to have some kind of big, recognizably, market penetrating kind of game that has it on it for people to sort of associate both the Australianness of the game, however you want to present that, with that symbol. You can't just suddenly put on everything and hope that people know what it means.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think to the question about whether, I know anything coming out of it, to be quite honest, as far as RPGs and so forth go, there's not a lot of noise about it, right? I mean, I think you, Steve, is one of the most recognizable, Australian publishing type / designer people I know. And even then, I don't think you would say that you were on the level of, any number of, UK, European, and American sort of publishing houses. Yeah. I think it's a shame, because I think there's so much stuff that's coming out of both the small press and indie and creative minds in Australia, in New Zealand, also in like Indonesia, around the Pacific Basin, that the Americans won't know what that is until someone sort of grabs it and puts it in their face and says, this is an Australian game, this is a New Zealand game. And, you know, honestly, if you want to sell domestic and have people have pride in it, that's one thing, right? But you want to get that international global feel and say, you know, we do a good job of this here. You know, we're really good at this. We're actually the sort of, you should have us on your shelf, whether you're in Australia or the US or, you know, Britain or anywhere. How to get there at that point becomes the mission, right? I think a brand isn't going to work. It's not going to do it until you have something that the brand happens to be associated with. So, you know, if it's drop bears, great. Everyone should have drop bears on their stuff now. But I don't think that's the case. I think that's kind of like, you know, you have to educate them first before you can get there.
We've got about 5 minutes left, so let's talk briefly about the future. What is there something we'd like to see changed or developed or grown in the industry in the next 10 years or 20 years? Where would we like to be, and do we have any idea how to get there? Matt, do you want to start off with that?
I think one of the things I'd love to see is this formalizing something like the TGDA into a bigger guild almost.
Right.
We really do have support, a centralized point for contact, even like a collective discounting bargaining chip, I guess, with shipping and manufacturing and distribution points in the US and things like that, so that it does make it a little bit easier for any Australian designer of any size to get through that process and try and work, if we are going to work with these smaller numbers, is try and collect ourselves together into that bigger number as a whole and then use that number to go across. And I think that's probably the key point, I think, to taking us to a next level in the Australian market.
Anyone else have any last thoughts on that?
I think convention. I once mentioned to Tom Fassel of Dice Tower, come to Australia, but then they never see Australia as big enough convention like PAX Australia. It's not big enough. I want to have more conventions like Essen, like GenCon, where it's kind of encouraging publishers to have booths, have more channels for them and easier. You don't have to travel overseas to display, to play test, to sell their games. You know, PAX Australia is the one I have to say it again. And CanCon, but it's still not like, you know, Kim, you've been overseas as well a lot of the time. Would you want that kind of thing in Australia, if possible?
I just know the realities of the costs of things at a convention, even a convention as big as Gen Con. It's really a marketing exercise, and you'd have to be a very big and successful company to make serious money at a convention like that. And that's, you know, you've seen the reasoning for some of the bigger companies pulling out of Gen Con just when there was going to be a dip in numbers there. It's not financially viable, you know, for them. So I know the biggest issue in coming to Australia and exhibiting at a convention, if you're paying all the flights in this direction for a small market where you can't possibly sell more than maybe 200 copies of your game, maybe 300 at the very most, is simply no way you can recover that. So we do that, but we've got a store, well, one of our partner companies has a store in Indianapolis, and we're able to use that as a base of operations for Gen Con. Life would be a lot harder if we didn't have that, you know, for an Australian publisher. It's really hard. That's why we're one of the only ones that have been able to do that, because we've got that local advantage there. So I just know, as much as we would want that kind of thing, that's really hard. I think some convention organizers, like Looking for Gamers, have done a pretty good job of trying to represent international companies by having well-managed booth spaces at small conventions in Australia. But again, until those conventions scale up, it's going to be hard to sort of see that really paying off. So there's just all sorts of challenges of scale that we have here with the small numbers. So I think it's going to stay realistically fairly casual for a while.
Also, Melbourne International Gaming Week. So that's coming in October, but that's mainly video games. Yeah.
Well, speaking of video games, Stephen, I know you're probably running out of time. I would kind of like to see some efforts made in expanding whatever support projects there are for video game development in Australia to tabletop games as well. And I think it's probably going to be easier for us to make that argument that there's a gaming culture that, and many people who play video games are going to play tabletop games and vice versa. So there's a kind of gaming culture that we could be looking to have the Australian government support and have some tabletop games, role-playing games, board games, card games included in those kind of grant schemes to get a little bit of support and help develop the sort of industry that we have here. So that's probably, I think, strategically where I'd be pushing.
I was able to actually, the Melbourne International Film Festival set up a meet and greet between film executives and producers with game designers, and they invited tabletop people as well. So that was a first chip into that sort of thing, and just recognizing that we're out there. All right, that's probably all we have time for. Thanks again for our international guests, especially for getting up early or staying up late. Can we just go around and tell everyone just quickly where you are and what your products are and where we can find you online? We'll start with Cam. We'll do this alphabetically.
Cool. Cam Banks. I'm on Twitter at Boy Monster. You can also find me on Instagram at Rusty Sellsword. And you can find the stuff that we do at Fandom Tabletop on Cortex RPG on Twitter and cortexrpg.com for the actual product.
Fantastic. Kim.
Kim from Good Games Publishing, and you can just find us at goodgamespublishing.com and you can get through all the socials. When this is out, this game will be released. That's our upcoming tile laying game, so look out for that in October. If you're in Australia watching at PAX, you'll be able to come and play it there, and play it online there, I should say, and find it all around Australia at that time.
Don't get my hopes up.
Matt, what about you?
I'm Platypus Industries, easy to find. We're platypusindustries.com.au. I have The Rat Catcher, which is my first game for solo. And of course, Drop Airs will be dropping later this year onto Kickstarter, and it's horrific, claw-filled, wonderful ways.
Fantastic. James.
I'm at James Wallace on Twitter, and Green Board Games, the company at which I'm studio manager, is greenboardgames.com.
And Stella.
University.com or on YouTube. We also have video contributors on the Dice Tower. You can find me Twitter, Meeple U, Instagram, Meeple_University, or Facebook, Meeple University. Also part of GovStudio.com. Gov Studios, GovStudios.com.
Gov Studios with a plural. Yep, that's important. We're really excited to see what Gov is bringing. And you can find me at tinstargames.com is my website. And we're going to be launching a new Kickstarter coming up soon in October as well for our role-playing game Relics.
Nice.
Thanks again for everyone for taking part, and enjoy the rest of PAX Online 2021.
Thank you.